Hello, this is To Be Read, in which we interview authors about their books on Brazil. Today we're going to be talking about Brazil, Britain, and slavery. Well, philosophical, religious, and economic reasons led Britain to embark in the 19th century on a strong international campaign against the trafficking of enslaved people and later against slavery itself, which we should add did not stop Britain from imposing different forms of forced labor in its domains in Africa and Asia until the 20th century. But this campaign against trafficking had a major impact on Brazil, which, despite not being an official British colony, had big political and financial ties to the British from its times as a Portuguese colony. In 1807, with Britain's support, the Portuguese royal family upped sticks to Rio de Janeiro to escape Napoleonic rule. In return, the Portuguese signed treaties in which they committed to abolish the trafficking of enslaved people. One treaty even established a set of rights and duties linked to the visit, capture, and adjudication of suspicious vessels by the British Navy, which would put the prohibition of slave trafficking into practice. In 1826, it was Brazil itself that made commitments in this sense during negotiations for it to be recognized as an independent country from Portugal. It also established the total abolition of slavery within the next 3 years, but that would only happen 6 decades later. In the decades that followed, military action by the British and the Atlantic had different phases with direct and indirect effects on the trade of African enslaved people in Brazil and on Brazilian domestic legislation. The Feijó Law of 1831, for example, prohibited the foreign trade of enslaved people. It's worth mentioning, however, that this rule was widely circumvented in the years that followed with the clear connivance of the Brazilian government. That gave rise to the expression lei para inglês ver, literally a law for the English to see, used to refer to rules that only exist on paper and are not properly enforced. While analyzing the implementation of the 1826 treaty with the Brazilian Empire reveals a series of nuances of that British pressure as well as contradictions over its practical effects. That's the topic of the book Seeking Capture, Resisting Seizure, written by Adriane Sanctis and recently published by the Max Planck Institute for Legal History and Legal Theory. Currently a researcher at Harvard University in the United States, Ms. Sanctis spoke to the Brazilian Report about her findings. Adriane, thanks very much for being here. It's a pleasure to speak to you. And let's go straight to the questions because I know you got a lot to tell us. So, if you will, explain us, please, how this type of treaty that Britain signed with Brazil in 1826, the so-called Triple Formula Treaty, worked in practice. Please.
Okay, thank you. It's great to be here talking to you. So, the Anglo-Brazilian Treaty for the suppression of the slave trade was one of the very first treaties Brazil signed when it became independent. And by ratifying it, Brazil did not just commit to the promise to abolish the slave trade, but also to a series of mechanisms that were designed to make the promise effective. So